In this video, I'm going to go into the witchcraft and similar prohibitions given in the Torah, as well as some other topics along the way. I know this may initially seem like a weird or pointless study to some. My personal perspective is that some of these commands are not always well understood, and even though we wouldn't have any intention of being involved in these things, part of the importance of understanding commands like these is so that we don't unintentionally add to or take away from the law. This is going to be a longer presentation. Whenever I first set out to share my research on this issue and to share some of my reasoning as a result of that research, I expected it to be more brief, but it developed into much more because I'm going to get into things like application and different claims about these commands and different practices that have been questioned or may be related to them. If you want, you can check the description box to jump between different topics as you wish. Whenever I was beginning to study more seriously about 14 years ago, I developed this axiom of sorts regarding the commands in the Torah. To be clear, I'm not saying the Torah necessarily has to be this way, but I carry this idea with me to this day whenever I think about different commands. My assumption is that the commands in the Torah have some sort of specific meaning to them, and that there is some sort of objective standard being given with a command. Sometimes, either unintentionally or intentionally, people will treat the law as if it is only about your personal direct relationship with God and how you personally serve Him. One critical aspect of the law is that it is the legal system of the land when following the government that Elohim commands in the Torah. It's true that there are some cases when it does matter what a person thinks or feels like they're doing. That being said, it cannot ultimately be just about personal conscience, because there has to be a standard by which people can be prosecuted in a human court. Recognizing that, I invite you to think back to some of the interactions you may have had with other people regarding the law. Hypothetically, you can probably imagine that someone might try to rationalize reasons as to why certain commands don't apply to their situation, or they may say they don't feel like it applies, or they may say that they feel like their heart is still pure, so it's supposedly okay to violate the letter of the law. Considering the application of that in the case of an actual court trial, if someone was tried for violating something in the law, would we just say that the conscience of the accused is the only thing that determines guilt or innocence in a court? If that was the case, obviously someone would plead that they didn't mean to do anything and then be free from punishment. Clearly that would lead to some perverse incentives in the legal system. Likewise, we wouldn't expect a reasonable judge to just rely on his emotions to tell him what the law requires, that is, what the Torah requires. Instead, we would expect that the law would be enforced according to what the law says, that is, through an informed understanding of the Torah. There's also another aspect of presuming some sort of objective standard to the commands. When it comes to commands like what are sometimes interpreted as a man shall not wear a garment of a woman, and so forth, if a person interprets that as a man supposedly has to wear what is culturally considered to not be women's clothes, then we should recognize that regardless of how obvious some people might think this is, opinions on those matters of what defines acceptable feminine or masculine dress can sometimes vary greatly. And so if that is the interpretation, then whose personal opinion or whose culture or which time period in that culture is considered the legally binding one? Now, obviously, there are other ways of looking at this command, and I have my own separate interpretation, which I don't intend to get into right now. But I raise this subject to bring up the broader point. Regarding the nature of the Torah commands, my personal inclination is there is more likely an objective Torah standard on these issues that is not just subject to the whims or preferences of the majority from a certain area or at a certain time, especially with something that may receive capital punishment in the land. It's possible I'm wrong with that point of view, but that has been one of my personal axioms regarding the law. Applying that to the issue of magic and witchcraft, I'm not comfortable with the idea of just judging whether something is considered witchcraft just by gut feeling or by an uninformed assumption. If you look across different cultures or different ways of thinking, there are all kinds of ideas about what might be magic or witchcraft. Also, sometimes people will use these commands, among others, to serve as kind of a generic catch-all in an unintentional attempt to throw anything they personally don't like under the banner of some command to justify personal preferences by projecting them onto the biblical text. Depending on whom you ask, things like certain genres of music can be claimed to be magic, certain public speaking techniques are claimed to be magic, visualization or deliberately imagining pictures in your head can be claimed to be magic. The act of eating certain things or inhaling the smoke of certain things is claimed to be magic. With all of these, depending on how motivated a person might be, it's possible to argue that they are prohibited, sometimes with more or less legitimacy. My question is, what does the law say? It's not important whether we define something by the words of magic or witchcraft per se, but instead the question is whether a given activity falls under one of the prohibited categories in the Torah, those being defined by the Hebrew words used in the law. So for me, that's where I think we need to look, and that is what we need to specify in more detail. Hypothetically, I would assume the law establishes a more specific standard that should inform us on this issue. There are a few passages and a few isolated commands here and there that address this issue of magic and related activity. Some of these matters, which I'm going to delve into, may not be seen as magic per se, but I'm going to address them together because the commands often have them grouped together. To start off with, one word that appears twice in the commands and once in the narrative of the Exodus is Kashaf. As a forewarning, the discussion of this word and related topics is going to be about half of the video. Sometimes one form of the word is translated as witch, and it is something that one is prohibited from being or allowing to be in the community. As with all these different words, part of my research was to delve into how these words were used in the text and how related words are used in other Semitic languages. While there are some exceptions, when it comes to the use of the Hebrew word, it was common for the word to only be seen in a list of violations. On the other hand, in looking at similar or identical words in other Semitic languages, sometimes there were very detailed descriptions of specific actions connected with these words. What I found with this specific word of Kashaf tended to be the practice of casting spells or using enchantments, and these were applied to both people and objects. Some of the descriptions I came across included people supposedly being inflicted by a disease as a result of someone casting a spell, people making figurines of other people and then presumably harming the figurine in order to cause harm to the person it represented, people intending to cause curses which involved spitting on another person, people using incantations to cast out demons, people enchanting food and offerings or other objects, people invoking gods against someone, presumably using an incantation and similar behaviors. Obviously, enchantment and the use of spells and the use of incantations could be applied in a vast number of ways, but that appears to be the overall meaning of the word. And to be clear, as we may have noticed with some of those examples, and as we may have already assumed, there doesn't appear to be a distinction between magic intended for good or magic intended for evil. While a lot of these examples that I looked at referred to people suffering some kind of harm or being worried about some kind of harm, there were times when enchantments and such were being used with good intentions or were used to protect against magic done with bad intentions. Some of these cultures of the people in and around the land seem to have this entire field of enchantments that were focused on supposedly doing good. So I see no distinction between those two things. One possibly outlying meaning I saw for this word was to cut, and that connection was not entirely clear to me. One person suggested maybe cutting herbs to make an enchanted potion, but I didn't see any evidence for that. It just seemed to be conjecture or guess. I would think if that was a legitimate connection, then we would see that indicated by the context at times, but I did not see any such thing in my reading. As a bit of a conjecture of my own, I would recognize that cutting and dividing in these languages seem to be associated with the concept of what they might have seen as fate or fortune, and one might suggest that these practices would be intended to alter fate in some sense, especially since some of these incantations were described as altering what different gods were supposedly doing. And I have observed that before, that some of these gods were talked about as being one that divides, one that sets fortune or fate, essentially. Obviously, I'm just discussing these ideas in the sense of trying to understand the subject matter of the command rather than for any other purpose. But the idea of cutting in the sense of dividing and setting fate made more sense to me and seemed to be backed up more than the alternative hypothesis about that meaning. It's also possible that the side meaning of cutting refers to something else entirely, or that it refers to a separate root entirely that may not be relevant. One other aspect of this word used for enchantment is the connection which appears in Exodus 7:11. In this verse, it refers to the wise men of Pharaoh and the ones doing the Kashaf, or enchanting and spellcasting, as I would understand it. And of course, as we know from the story of the Exodus and the plagues, that these were people that were trying to mimic the signs and wonders performed by Moses and Aaron in order to show Pharaoh that it wasn't relevant and that there was some other explanation for what was going on. Therefore, he didn't need to listen to Moses and Aaron. In that verse, it also describes those people doing these things as Chartom, and that appeared to be connected with the Lector priests of Egypt. Because of that connection in this verse, I also researched their views on this subject. Of course, there's not an explicit command that says, "You shall not be a Chartom," but there is a clear connection between at least some of the things that these people did and the word in question which we are dealing with. What I saw was a lot of the same things that we've already discussed. There were incantations that were done by them with either constructive or destructive intent, including different enchantments for healing or for warding off evil spirits and such. There was the making and the use of magic charms. There was the creation and use of figurines described before, and the needling or otherwise damaging or destroying these figures to harm the person represented. So there did appear to be a lot of connection with what was done by these Lector priests and the behaviors which were associated with the word in question, which we already looked at. In addition, I saw some other references to things like divination and soothsaying, which makes sense that they would also be involved with. But personally, I think those practices are more strongly associated with some different words, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Keep in mind regarding the Lector priests, since that's not an explicitly discussed thing in the commands, I am not suggesting that whatever they did automatically falls under the word in the command, nor am I saying that every single thing they did is automatically not allowed, but I'm referencing them because of this association which appears in that verse. It's not necessarily the exact same thing, but there clearly was some kind of connection. So what I see with Kashaf is an association with incantations, enchantment, or spells. This appears to be done for both people or objects with a variety of intentions. So a person doing such a thing might do some ritual and or recite some specific phrase or series of phrases, and as a result the intention is to cause some sort of divine power to either be placed into an object or to affect some person or the things the person does. While that may be fairly clear, I do think it should raise some questions as to the exact lines and boundaries as to what is prohibited. What I'm about to say might be considered ridiculous at first when you realize where I'm going with it, but I think it's useful to explore the extremes of how this word might be applied so we can better understand the meaning of the command. In my understanding of those practices, it was common to expect that gods or spirits were involved with this beyond just whatever the person was saying or doing. I often saw invocations where, in the process of doing the incantation, a person would explicitly call upon some god or spirit either to do the thing or to help them with it. And there also appeared to be this understanding that the person had to appeal to that supposed entity and gain favor in order for the incantation to work. So while there was this emphasis on using very precise incantations, at least some of the time, and there did seem to be emphasis placed on the presumed inherent power of words, some of these practices were not that much different from what some people do while praying. As we know, in rabbinic or traditional Judaism, there are ritualistic prayers, which are done at specific times and with specific wordings. And while most of them are just a blessing or an offering of thanks, some of them do involve asking or telling Elohim to do something. Of course, these are often not a part of the actual commands of the written law, but there are examples of similar behavior in the law. Deuteronomy 26:12-15 has a ritual prayer which includes asking or telling Elohim to bless the people and the land. Numbers 6:23-27 describes the ritual blessing which is done by Aaron and his sons. Also, there are other examples of praying for healing of another person or praying for protection and so forth. There's also the curse described in Numbers 5, which some might even see as enchanting an object, a mixture of water in this case. So I think there are some questions on where the lines might be drawn on this, and I could see two perspectives. One perspective might be that we're dealing with the specific definition of the word, and if we know the exact details of the definition and how the word is used, then we would know everything we need to know. The other perspective might be that we might project exceptions onto the command or ways that the command doesn't apply, even if a given action described elsewhere in the Torah would technically fall under the scope of the word in the way the word is normally used. As a general rule, I'm more in favor of the former approach, but I'm not ruling out the latter. Obviously, one could point out that if we are commanded to do something, then that exact thing is not going to be a violation, but that doesn't necessarily help us with the meaning of the commands. In my opinion, I think it's incredibly unlikely that prayer, even when involving requests for good or bad, would inherently fall under the practice. Indeed, even though there was some correlation with prayer at times, that did not seem to be the overall meaning of the word in my reading, and that's just aside from things which are said, like in Deuteronomy 4:7, about him being there whenever you call for him, thus implying it is acceptable and normal, I would assume. Although I'd be strongly skeptical of the following view, one might suggest that maybe the difference is whether you're calling upon him versus calling upon others. There are examples in the Torah where that clearly was not sufficient to cover over the forbidden practice which was being done. Just because people were referring back to Elohim didn't make it okay, like with the gold calf, or the supplanting of the priesthood, or any number of violations which occurred in the latter parts of the Tanakh as well. Despite that, or maybe as a continuation of that, apparently that view is similar to one implied by certain Jewish traditions. While I personally would consider the following examples to be questionable at the very least, there are some long-standing practices, at least with certain Jewish groups, wherein objects are being enchanted, objects were made with the specific purpose of warding off the evil eye or otherwise guarding against evil spirits. Certain gestures or certain recitations or incantations were being done to counteract the evil eye. Enchanted amulets were being made and worn that contained certain images or text written in them to make them supposedly prevent or cure illness. I came across the suggestion of using the priestly blessing as some sort of enchantment. Passages from the Torah were recited in order to protect a person from illness. And of course, there's the somewhat notorious example of the supposed creation of the golem or the golem. If you're not familiar with that, feel free to look it up. Also, I had a personal experience where I was attending a congregation's evening service for the first and only time, and at one point they closed off all the doors and told people to essentially observe this ritual respect. Then they opened up a cabinet that had their Torah scroll in it, and the thing about it which struck me the most was when they told people to pray to it. They told people to pray toward the scroll because, according to them, people had supposedly prayed to the scroll or prayed toward the scroll, and they allegedly said that it aided in the prayer being answered. While I don't think that personal feelings are anything close to a reliable gauge of whether something is good or bad, I remember feeling quite uncomfortable by the whole ordeal. And while to my knowledge someone hadn't deliberately enchanted the scroll, at the same time it seemed to be treated as if it were an enchanted object. Clearly there are examples of, at the very least, similar behaviors being done in certain circles. So even though one might be inclined to think that obviously any person that cares about Elohim and Torah is not going to try to do magic, and while some of these cases could be considered borderline, some of them do strongly resemble Kashaf, especially when it comes to seeking to imbue objects or otherwise create objects with alleged miraculous power and use such things as a result. That's something that I would assume to be a violation of this command, considering the apparent connections with the word as we discussed, at the very least the creation of those things in the acts of the enchanting. Also, contrary to some suggestions, I don't view these sorts of practices as precedented in the Torah either. It's been suggested that the blood from the Passover on the doorposts and lintel, or the blue wool thread in the tassels, could be considered similar, or one might recognize certain objects like the altar and the ark and the tent of meeting as being considered holy and sacred. And also, as a possibly closer example, there's the bronze serpent, which people are supposed to look at after they had been bitten. In my view, there's a difference between at least most of those practices in the Torah and the aforementioned enchantment issue, because they generally point back to either doing a thing because it's commanded, or having something be a sign that you have done a thing, or something being a reminder to do a thing. As far as I see it, the Torah doesn't refer to any of those objects as being inherently mystical or divinely powered or anything like that, at least with the object itself, unlike the case with some of the previous examples where power is supposedly being put into objects through the use of specific words or images or otherwise, and then the objects are being used to bring about good or bad because of the supposed power that was put into it. While I'm not entirely settled on the exact lines, I would see that sort of practice of enchanting objects and casting spells, like some of what was referred to, as falling under this prohibition. One final issue that's sometimes associated with this word, at least indirectly, is the question regarding using substances, either natural or synthetic substances, for the purpose of some sort of psychological or physiological change. This is going to be a longer aside, and I didn't want to make a separate video about this subject, and it is related to this topic at hand, at least in some ways. Of course, having already gone through the meaning of the word kasaf and the possible implications of it, we probably wouldn't recognize any direct inherent connection to substances, and rightly so in my view. But the reason I bring this up is because of how this word is translated in the early Greek translations of the Torah. We're probably already aware that these translations are not always accurate, and of course, what's actually important is what the Hebrew word says and what the law says as a result of that, rather than focusing on any translation. But at the same time, there's no shortage of people that will say that the use of substances as such is supposedly inherently immoral, especially the ones that the accuser's culture or government that they have lived under considers to be taboo or dangerous. If that belief is strong enough, one might assume that it has to be in the law also. The only argument in favor of that, which had any semblance of basis in the text, was one that harkens back to this word that we've been looking at. Many years ago, a friend mentioned the Greek translation of this word to me as a result of a commentary he was reading on the New Testament book of Revelation. In that book, it condemns the behaviors which fall under this Greek word, and that word which is used in Revelation is the same word which the Greek translation of the Torah uses instead of kasaf, and that word is Pharmakos. and clearly the words pharmacy and pharmaceutical are derived from this word. The commentary suggested that all such substances were prohibited because that passage in Revelation used this Greek word, but interestingly enough, the commentary somehow forced an exception into that in order to say that if the substance was prescribed by a doctor or something, then it was somehow okay. Frankly, it's hard for me to take that kind of interpretation seriously. If I hypothetically accepted that passage and that interpretation of that Greek word that all medicines or poisons are prohibited, then I wouldn't see how the opinion of the individual like a doctor or the opinion of some group of individuals like a secular legislature would have any bearing on the morality of an issue by the standard of the text. There's no example of those kinds of opinions being relevant with any other prohibition. From a cynical perspective, to me, this looks like what someone would have done if they wanted to keep taking medicine, but also wanted to find a way to say that other people cannot take certain other things which might be deemed unuseful or dangerous. The first thing I would reaffirm about this issue is that we've already gone through the Hebrew word, and there is not an apparent connection in that word to this issue directly. Even though it is arguably irrelevant, I will say that in my research of this Greek word, I found that the more original meaning appears to be much more similar to the Hebrew word. It apparently referred more to things like enchantment and incantations and charms, rather than directly referring to medicine or other substances, at least originally, in the connection to medicine and the use of herbs or poisons or whatever came about later. From my reading on these issues, it was common for the medical professional of ancient times to also effectively be a practitioner of magic at the same time. They would sometimes practice incantations or the use of charms while administering the medicine, even though those two things were individually considered distinct, at least in some of these cultures and languages. So even though the medicine or the substance itself had a physiological or psychological influence on the person taking the medicine might be instructed to say an enchantment over the medicine as they were taking it, or to also wear enchanted objects or charms which the medical professional may have made. If we go back to the Hebrew word, which is what is actually important here, I would not see any hint of there being an inherent problem with the substance or pharmaceutical aspect of it, only the enchantment and charm aspect of it, which appeared to be more the original use of the Greek word, which appears in the translation. With regard to what the Torah says about the substance issue, although alcohol is indicated in the law as affecting judgment, and therefore the priests are not allowed to consume it as they approach the tent of meeting as described in Leviticus 10, and although habitual consumption is listed alongside other unwise or bad behaviors when describing the rebellious son in Deuteronomy 21, on the other hand, there is no overt prohibition for the general public, even in terms of being a drunkard for that matter, and there very easily could have been if it was intended. Obviously, if there is a prohibition with the priests, then if it was intended that no one was supposed to engage in that, then it could have said that. Fundamentally, alcohol can be very dangerous. It's mind-altering, even in small or supposedly reasonable amounts, as we know. It can affect one's perception. It has the possibility of being lethal depending on the amount. It has the potential of being addictive or can become habitual. And some modern thinking on it, whether true or not, is that even small amounts are not necessarily good for a person. So either way, we have this dangerous substance which our culture does not consider taboo, but at the same time it exhibits all of the traits that people often point to when condemning other substances. From the perspective of the text, there isn't any general prohibition on it, and there's no statement that says to not get drunk or to not raise your blood alcohol level beyond a certain point. And regardless of whether the person was under the influence or not, they are still obviously accountable for whatever they do. The closest thing in the text which could be relevant to that is the passage about the rebellious son, and whenever the person is being described, it says he is stubborn and contentious, and he does not listen to his parents, he does not accept discipline, and also says he is gluttonous and a habitual drinker. When looking at this passage, the frame is not that the people are executing all drunkards. The initial frame is that there's a defiant son who is apparently still involved with his parents, and that is also one of the things which he is engaged with, the alcohol. While I would not frame this as an ideal parenting situation, in my personal opinion, we have to consider the context of this and what the situation is alluding to. I'm not fond of the idea of using threats, but I assume sometimes parents feel like they don't know what to do, and with that, sometimes threats are used. And while there are extreme examples of just totally disagreeable men which are not cut out for living in society at all, on the other hand, if the son knows this is an actual legal thing, he's probably going to want to shape up if he's posed with the threat of being taken to the gate before the elders for not listening. So getting back to the drunkard part, if it was intended as a general prohibition on being a drunkard, and therefore that all drunkards are supposed to be eliminated, that is not what I see described here. While it's certainly true that it's something considered unwise or unproductive, and we also have proverbs and other cultural writings which condemn habitual drinking, I don't have the belief which everything that is unwise is automatically against the Torah. Beyond that, there are plenty of other substances which we know were known about or used at the time, and some of them are mentioned explicitly in the text, such as with the mandrakes in Genesis 30. While they were normally used for fertility, and that's the clear implication in that passage, even small doses have the potential to cause terrifying hallucinations, from my understanding. Likewise, things like frankincense and some of the other components mentioned in the tabernacle compounds are known to be mind-altering, of course, some of them with a more or less potent effect. All of that being recognized, there's no generalized command about this issue, and we would assume to see such if there is actually intended to be a prohibition. While the only thing close to a textual basis for this claim typically comes back to this word in question, as we've already established, the issue at hand is not the consumption of these things, but the enchantment, the incantations, and things related to that. And also, since we're somewhat close to the issue, things like burning incense, obviously that is done with the tent of meeting and allowed, and I don't see a general command against such for other uses either. The only exception is in copying the tabernacle recipe. That particular compound is supposed to be reserved for use in the tent of meeting exclusively and is not allowed to be used otherwise. So I don't see any inherent problem with incense or similar, although some practices may include incantations, which obviously would fall under this prohibition. Wrapping up on this word, I think it is reasonable to wonder as to the exact boundaries of this command, but I would emphasize the aspect of enchanting objects and attempting to cast spells on people. The next word that I want to go into is Chavar. This will be a lot quicker to go through than the previous word. One of the meanings of this word, and the way it is used most often, is to join or be joined or to associate or to unite. It's possible that this word in the magic context is actually a separate, unrelated word, but on the other hand, joining and associating could easily be the base meaning of the word. In Deuteronomy 18:11 through 12, it prohibits doing this thing. In my research of it, there was a discussion of placing some type of paralysis or restraint upon someone, either physical paralysis or some type of inhibition, and also possibly other types of charms or enchantments were being attempted. Clearly there is some overlap with the previous word that we looked at. So what I concluded from my research, especially with that of other Semitic languages and cultures on this word, was that it may refer to magic binding and magic bonds and or enchantments and charms. So one way of interpreting the phrase in Deuteronomy 18:11 is one magically binding a magic bond, or one enchanting an enchantment, or one charming a charm. It's possible this is a specific type of enchantment that may also be a part of this previous word, or maybe it is related but a separate practice. I will note that the previous word appears immediately before this one in the list of prohibitions in Deuteronomy 18, and that may or may not be relevant to its meaning. As far as all the detailed discussion of this, since it's related to enchantment, I think I can just refer back to what we've already covered on that subject, and that will pretty well address this issue also. So these two words fall under my personal non-textual category of spells and enchantment. And as far as my personal definitions are concerned, that would be the extent of the direct issues of magic in the text. However, there appears to be two other categories which can accompany the discussion of magic in the commands. And those two additional categories would be, in my own words, divination and interaction with spirits and those who are dead. In Leviticus 19:26, there are 3 prohibitions, and I would see 2 of them as clearly referring to types of divination. I'll start with the word Nachash. While in my research I did find related words which implied the use of incantations once again, the main use of the word that I came across appeared to be related to omens, seeking omens, interpreting omens, or one supposedly having good or bad fortune tied to them. The latter part of that especially comes into play in Numbers 23:23, alongside another word which we are going to look at. In this passage, the speaker seems to see Israel as not having a bad omen over them. Looking to the way the verb is used, it appears in Genesis and seems to refer to the use of a cup for divination, maybe for looking for patterns in a mixture of water or oil or something along those lines, in order to supposedly gain knowledge or to predict the future, and that was a practice that was done at times by other cultures. So from what I see, it refers to divination, to practices of looking for omens, or the presumed art of finding patterns that supposedly reveal some issue. Next, in Leviticus 19:26 is Anan. It appears alongside the previous word a number of times in the Tanakh, but there are not any real clues from the way it's used in my view. The word for cloud is very similar, and some have suggested that maybe it refers to divination by clouds. While that is a possibility, I also think it's possible that there is a more basic underlying meaning which the word and the word for cloud may have been derived from. One possibility is that the basic meaning was to appear or to serve or to send a message. Some have suggested that maybe it refers to a type of medium rather than strictly the act of divination, whereas some others have suggested observing times or weather or using astrology. The research into related words was not especially revealing, and there were references, again, to reciting or to humming or to muttering. So while one could speculate as to the nature of the connection, assuming there is one, it's not entirely clear to me. What I see as likely is that the word refers to seeking out or interpreting different natural phenomena or presumed messages in the world. And this is backed up by the tradition on the subject too, so it would be a prohibition on soothsaying or divination and interpretation of omens, maybe in general or maybe in some specific ways. The last clear example of this category of divination, as I would see it, is in Deuteronomy 18:10, and this one is Qasam. We have some context clues with this one, such as in Ezekiel 21:21 or 21:26. To be clear, the reason I'm referring to that verse is to help me to understand the meaning of this word. I'm using the verse as information about the language, which will hopefully inform me about the law, rather than looking at it as information about the law directly. The verse in Ezekiel uses the word in question and apparently describes some different ways that practice was done, with 2 of these being clear and common examples of divination practices. One is divination by the use of arrows, and while there are different ways that such a thing was done, one practice, as I understood, was to put different words on arrows in a quiver, and then one would draw an arrow from it and see which one came out. And then apparently they would use that to make a decision or otherwise predict the future. Another one mentioned, which I came across in multiple contexts, was the analysis of a liver in order to determine the future. The other practice mentioned in that verse was the asking of the teraphim. This is a little more debated as to what it means. One view is that the teraphim were images that were consulted. One other view is they are actual remains of people from a family, possibly remains being made into some sort of figure, and they were supposed to relay messages from beyond in protection of the family. So depending on what that entailed, it could be seen as attempting to consult with the dead rather than being strictly divination per se, at least by my personal categorization. But either way, this word of Qasam is apparently prediction or the seeking of oracles, especially through the use of divination or possibly by summoning spirits or seeking counsel from the dead. What I saw in related languages seemed to back this up, although it was a little more broad. I did see reference to divination by arrows and casting lots and such. I also saw magic and enchantment being referred to, and there was reference to a person being summoned to a court via a similar word. So one might speculate that maybe there could be some kind of connection with the aforementioned teraphim, which appeared in Ezekiel, or something similar, but that aspect is unclear. What does appear to be clear is that the word refers to different types of divination to determine the future. So that's the last clear reference to divination that I wanted to get into. There are two other phrases that may also relate to the subject in the law, but it's not entirely clear. Going back to Deuteronomy 18:10, once again, there is a reference alongside these other commands about how one is not supposed to make their son or daughter pass through fire. From what I have seen, this phrase seems to be commonly connected with Deuteronomy 12:31, where it refers to the Canaanites burning their children in the fire for their Elohim. It should be noted, however, that this is a different phrase which is used in Deuteronomy 18, and the term causing to pass through the fire is not obviously synonymous. It doesn't appear to be a euphemism for it, and one would have to wonder what the purpose would be for having a supposed euphemism in one verse and not in the other. One suggestion was that maybe it does not actually refer to child sacrifice in Deuteronomy 18:10. That seems like a possibility, and then the question is, what does the phrase actually refer to? I didn't see a lot of evidence for this, so this is not well substantiated, but one suggestion was that maybe it refers to divination by burn marks. I don't know, but I thought I would mention this. The other unclear reference could be in Leviticus 21-5, and this immediately precedes some of the other commands that we're about to get into. This passage is normally seen as prohibiting sacrificing one's child to this other god, and I think that is the plain meaning of it, but I thought I would bring up one related piece of information that I came across. Years ago, whenever I understood Exodus 23:13 as prohibiting the mention of the names of other Elohim, instead of understanding it as forbidding the invoking of the names of other Elohim, which is my current view, I had questions about this passage because it was an example of a command that apparently used the name of another Elohim, so just the fact of someone reading that command out loud would cause someone to say the name of another Elohim. So back during that time, I tried exploring alternate views on this, and one thing I noticed was a suggestion that there was a derived Canaanite word in later use that referred to a specific offering, and one speculation was that it was some type of divination ritual. Of course, one could easily look to 1 Kings 11 and see that that name is applied to an Ammonite god explicitly, so the plain traditional understanding could easily be correct, but I thought I'd bring that up as a possibility since it does appear alongside these passages, so it could relate to the underlying issue either way. One final thing I want to point out about the description in the text of this issue starts in Deuteronomy 18:14. In the passage, it refers to the Canaanites listening to these people who practice divination, and in my view, the following verses contrast that against listening to prophets of Elohim instead. As a bit of an aside, some have the view that this passage just talks about listening to one single prophet, but that is not what I see based on the end of the chapter especially, because the passage describes how to discern between a true prophet and a false prophet rather than determining a person to be the single prophet versus being not that single prophet. I would emphasize verses 20 through 22 in that regard, but this is a separate subject for a separate video. So since the sons of Israel are expected to listen to prophets rather than listening to the ones doing divination, I would assume that divination, as it is being defined here, is in the sense of gaining knowledge through mystic arts, or essentially arbitrary means, especially hidden knowledge about the future in some sense. On the other side of things, some might point to the casting of lots in the Day of Covering ritual in Leviticus 16, or the allotment of the land toward the end of Numbers by lot. In my personal opinion, I would assume that the casting of lots in those situations is to make an essentially arbitrary decision rather than predict the future or anything like that. So just flipping a coin or rolling dice or something just to leave a decision to randomness, I wouldn't see that as inherently being divination. But if someone was using those same things in an attempt to predict the future or elicit some divine information, that would be a problem. Some might also wonder about the Urim and the Thummim. Personally, I'm not confident in what those actually are. I'm aware of some of the traditions on it, and some being that it's a type of divination, but not really knowing for certain what they are makes it hard to give any legitimate comment on it. With regard to practices of divination in general today, this is something we can clearly see in parts of our society. Some still engage in things for the purpose of predicting the future or gaining hidden knowledge, like with tarot card reading, or even with whimsical practices like picking petals off of a flower to say, he loves me not. Sometimes with more or less seriousness, of course, but fundamentally that doesn't really change what it is. There are also rituals like Groundhog Day and similar ceremonies that are supposed to foretell the future. However, I do think it's important that we exercise discretion with regard to what we categorize as divination. While probably none of us would want to do this, I've seen divination used as a category to just throw completely unrelated things under it in order to condemn those things. So I think we need to try to be cautious and precise about this issue and others. I would like to take this into a similar extreme as with the enchantment commands. I think there's a potential to wonder, at least briefly, about anything that involves an art or a model which is either used to predict the future on some level or to sense something beyond our immediate awareness. Of course, discussing it on this level, we're getting more and more into my personal logic, and even though I'm trying to root my reasoning in the text and the words used, I wanted to make sure that I'm recognizing that. One might wonder about whether personal certainty or the frame around any action has any relevance, such as with a meteorological forecast or an economic forecast. Those are generally understood as a matter of probabilities and potential rather than a matter of certainty or divine information about the future. Personally, I hesitate somewhat about the intent or framing aspect because, as mentioned at the very beginning of the video, focusing on intent has the potential to create excuses for personal behavior. That being said, intent can matter textually, at least some of the time, such as with manslaughter, but we shouldn't ignore the fact that such an excuse could be misused and it's not always relevant. All things being considered, my inclination about the issue of divination would be that most of us observe what is going on around us, and we focus on individual details that we notice, whether we realize we're doing it or not, and then we make our own personal forecasts about where we think things are going, either in the long term or even the extremely short term. We might think a business or job is viable, or we might decide it's a good idea to start planting crops now. All of that on a personal level involves some type of a system of observation and decision-making based on an observation or based on the feelings that came up. Even though I assume that most of that is almost entirely random or arbitrary based on our individual experiences, I would not assume it to be divination. Likewise, something like meteorology, even though it has more of an art or explicit system behind it, I think it would be a similar frame, a similar idea. On the other side of this, one might wonder about whether legitimacy and accuracy of a practice has any relevance to whether it's forbidden or not. My assumption would be that it doesn't have any relevance, just like with the previous example of individual reasoning and assumptions about the future. If it was inaccurate or accurate, I wouldn't think that would change the underlying action as to whether it's divination or not. Interestingly, I saw some Jewish traditions that seemed to be arguing that astrology was okay because it supposedly was accurate according to them. Personally, I think that's unreasonable, but that may be my problem. One other thought I had regarding this issue was the issue of closeness of the observation to the actual issue at hand. What I mean is, if I go outside and all of a sudden I see a bunch of birds just fly out of the woods squawking, I might assume that they had seen or heard something in the woods, like an animal that scared them, and that may have caused them to fly away. Even though one divination practice was to observe flight patterns and behaviors of birds, my assumption would be that observing that information in my example involves more of a direct causal relationship rather than some supposed spiritual, esoteric, or hidden knowledge that's being connected with something that's physically unrelated. Another obvious example might be taking a thin metal rod and assuming the soil is relatively soft, pushing the metal rod through the soil to detect the position of a water pipe or something. If I hit a hard object around the frost line, it seems to follow a path where I thought the water line was, then I would guess that the water line is probably there, even though I cannot see it, even though I'm using a tool to detect it, in this case by touching it. What about something like divining rods, though? Witching for water, or using divining rods to detect water lines or other lines underground, or water in general. In the language itself, it has this presumption of being something that would be forbidden. But is that necessarily the case? Now, this is something that I have witnessed done multiple times by multiple different people. The way I typically saw it done was by taking two metal wires shaped into L's and being held in each hand, sometimes encased in a small tube to reduce the influence of the person on the movement. And the person would walk through an area that was assumed to have the water line or electric line or whatever, and then the wires would move toward each other, supposedly, whenever the person was over the buried line. I'm also aware this is used to find water, and I'm aware that sometimes a Y-shaped branch is used, especially from a willow tree, and the movement of it is supposed to indicate the detection of the water or otherwise. The first thing I thought I'd point out is the use of the willow branch. Some people might say that willow trees were supposedly treated as having magical properties, so one might assume that makes it a problem. But in my view, all sorts of things are claimed by some people as having some sort of mystical property to it, and I see no command that says anything about not making things out of willow trees or anything like that. So I would not criticize that part of it. Also, every time I saw this practice done, I never witnessed any enchantment being done over the tools or the process, and it was never framed as gaining some type of hidden spiritual knowledge or anything like that. As far as the accuracy is concerned, of course, a lot of people would very quickly just throw this out as complete nonsense. I'm fully aware that most of the studies, although not all of them, indicate that it doesn't actually work, and I know there are arguments to say that it's just subconscious influence and confirmation bias when it does work, but as I said before, I don't think legitimacy has any bearing on whether something's divination or not, one way or the other. On the other hand, if one thinks there is a basis for the practice, one could view it as just another example of something that's not well understood and is being considered magic just because it's not understood. And nowadays everything has to be explained by quote-unquote science in order for it to be real. If it's true that it is some type of electromagnetic field influencing the movement of the rods, whether it actually is or not, of course, is another question, but just hypothetically, would that really be any different from poking a rod into the ground in order to sense the line? In that hypothetical way of looking at it, it could be seen as just using tools to sense the physical environment. The people I'm aware of that believe the practice work have similar views on it, and they don't necessarily know how it works, but they just know that it works. They don't think of it as some kind of hidden art or secret art that calls upon the divine or anything like that. And in that frame, it would appear to me to be different from examining something which is just completely detached from the question at hand. Some of the clear examples of divination we touched on earlier were like examining a sheep's liver to predict the future, or get information about a person, or predict the weather, or something just completely unrelated to that sheep. And the drawing of the arrows from the quiver would have absolutely no relationship with any underlying issue being posed. That's just my personal opinion, but I would assume that divination is more along those lines. It's more about gaining hidden knowledge through means which are unrelated to the issue at hand. And it would be more about certainty and prediction and revelation rather than just an attempt to sense the environment or make assumptions based on that. That would be my understanding of the underlying issue. Ultimately, though, what is important is the words which are used in the text of the commands and how the words are understood which are being used. The last category, by the way I am categorizing it, is the subject of interaction with spirits and interaction with the dead. And some of these words or phrases are more clear than others. Deuteronomy 18:11 gives a very plain example of this. It refers to one inquiring to those who are dead, and it prohibits this practice. It appears to just use the commonly used words to describe this, and it appears to just be a plain and obvious statement. So that is something which is not allowed to be done, inquiring of one who is dead. Alongside that prohibition, and also appearing a number of times throughout the text, is a prohibition related to the Oboth and to the Yidd'oni, both of these being plural words. With regard to the Oboth, there are a few context clues if we look in the Tanakh. There's the story about Saul calling up Samuel through the woman at Endor. Based on what it says, one could read her description as possibly saying that she either possesses one of these Oboth or that she is a master of them in some sense. And then she proceeds to call up Samuel from the dead. This is consistent with my other research on it, although the evidence is limited. The word appears to refer to either a supposed returned presence of a once-gone being, or a being which still remains in some capacity though dead, such as something like a ghost or otherwise some sort of spirit. However, it may be considered distinct from inquiring of the dead in general, because the verse we already looked at prohibited that plainly, even apart from this. So I'm not clear on that exact distinction, but the commands refer to inquiring of such a thing, and also possibly of having such a thing in a person, as I would understand Leviticus 20:27. Frequently alongside this word, as mentioned, is the other word, Yidd'oni. The same commands apply to this word as with the previous. This word may derive from the word for knowing or knowledge. This one's somewhat uncertain in my view due to a lack of evidence. Some traditions have suggested that it refers to a type of divination similar to what we've already looked at, or some type of practice of enchantment. What seems more likely to me is that some type of familiar spirit or spirit of knowledge which is being consulted or is supposedly within someone. It would make sense that a familiar spirit would be called a knowing one, since that is the presumed purpose of such a hypothetical being. Since this word is referred to in many of the same ways as the Oboth, I would assume that this connection is purposeful, and it would appear to support the understanding of consulting spirits in some form. So the word appears to me to be familiar spirits or something similar, although I will recognize that there may be other possibilities. One final passage, and this is an uncertain one, is a verse that we considered earlier with regard to divination, which is Leviticus 19:26. The way I've understood the beginning of this verse is that, literally, you shall not eat with the blood. Therefore, not eating something that wasn't bled out, as I would interpret it practically. As a reminder, this is separate from the other commands which do explicitly and plainly say to not eat blood. However, with this one verse, there are some alternative views in some of the traditional writings, and one explanation in particular does appear to have basis in the practices of some other cultures. The view was that this verse doesn't say to not eat with the blood, but it says to not eat over the blood. That is a legitimate meaning for that word. The word translated as with or over or on, it carries all of those meanings, so it could be any of those. The person suggesting over the blood offered the explanation that blood might be poured into a basin or a pit or something else in order to call in spirits, and then people would eat over it or eat alongside it for the purpose of communicating with those spirits, which are supposedly called in by the offering of the blood. Based on my briefly looking into this, that does appear to have been a practice that was done at some point, at least in some form. There is a Roman writing which describes a similar practice. As far as evidence for the meaning of the command, though, there is a passage in 1 Samuel 14 that describes the people violating this command, but in my opinion, it's not specific enough to know what it means in that context. Either interpretation seems plausible in that passage. One might say that because it is in the same verse as divination practices, that surely that means it's referring to the latter interpretation, but the division between verses is not necessarily significant, and it's possible that it's separate from the two commands that follow it. It is not joined with those two commands that follow it through any conjunction or any other indicator, so it could be read either way, or maybe even another view could be possible. I thought I would offer it as a possibility under this category. And either way, there is the other command regarding not eating blood. Those are the commands and the issues that I wanted to cover in regard to magic and related subjects. It appears to me that these commands refer to different types of enchantment, types of divination, and types of communication with spirits or with the dead. And now I want to wrap up by going through my translation of different passages in the text that I focused on. Exodus 22:17 or 18, a female spellcaster you shall not let live. Leviticus 19:26, you shall not eat with, alternately over, the blood. You shall not foretell through omens, and you shall not soothsay. Leviticus 19:31, you must not turn to the ghosts and to the familiar spirits. You must not seek to be unclean through them. Leviticus 26, and the being which shall turn to the ghosts and to the familiar spirits to prostitute after them, and I shall place my face against that being, and I shall cut him off from the midst of his people. Leviticus 20:27, and a man or woman that a ghost or a familiar spirit shall be in them, they shall surely be caused to die. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood is upon them. Deuteronomy 18:10 through 11, one shall not be found in you, causing his son and his daughter to cross through fire, one divining divinations, a soothsayer, and one foretelling through omens, and one casting spells, and one magically binding with magic bonds, alternatively, one enchanting charms, and one asking a ghost and a familiar spirit, and one inquiring of the dead.